And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather again showing the next storm system, low center pulling northward, and by later tonight, after midnight sometime, will pull north of the central Aleutians there, and this warm front will spread snow and blowing snow up along the southwest coast and in across the Kuskokwim Delta, pushing northward into at least a portion of the Yukon Delta toward morning. Lingering flurries here along the Alaska Range and up over the western North Slope Brooks Range, but nothing significant. Stays dry in the Panhandle. And then for tomorrow, the system pushes northeastward here, and moisture having a tough time getting eastward here, but there'll still be snow and blowing snow for the Yukon Delta, St. Lawrence Island, and mixture of precipitation, warmer air sliding northwestward or northward here ahead of the front into the Kuskokwim Delta. Rain, wind, Alaska Peninsula, more showery for the Aleutians. Colder, drier, and windier for the Panhandle for the next couple of days. No change over the eastern interior. And you can see snow in the west, variably cloudy in the central interior, clear and cold in the eastern part of the state, as well as the Panhandle into the Gulf. Next weaker system here on Thursday, spreading some rain and snow into the central Aleutians. Coastal water forecast for the south coast, north to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots, central coast east winds 25 knots, and the north coast east to northeasterlies at 20 to 25. Lynn Canal tomorrow, north winds 30 knots with higher gusts, and north winds 25 knots for Stevens Passage, north at 15 for Clarence Strait. And then for Thursday, on the south coast here, east winds 20 gusts 35 knots, central coast east winds 30 gusts 45 knots, and for the north coast, east winds at 30 knots. Lynn Canal, winds still north at 30 knots with higher gusts, northeast 25 for the Stevens Passage area, and east or northwest winds at 20 for Clarence Strait. And then for Prince William Sound tomorrow, light north winds at 10 knots, northeast 10 for northern Cook Inlet. And for the eastern North Gulf Coast, variable to north winds 10 to 25 knots, western North Gulf Coast north at 20, Barren Islands northwest 15, southern Cook Inlet and Kamishak Bay looking at small craft advisories for northeast winds at 25 knots. And then big increase in the winds here, especially for the Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, east winds 50 knots. That's good for storm warnings there. Gale warning, southern Cook Inlet, northeast at 35 knots, otherwise 20 knots north of the Forelands. Prince William Sound, east winds 20 knots, seas 4 feet. And for the North Gulf Coast, east winds 30 to 35 knots. Kodiak Island tomorrow, south to east winds 15 to 20 knots, east winds 30 knots for the Bristol Bay area. And the Alaska Peninsula, southeast winds, 30 knots. Outlook for Thursday, Alaska Peninsula, west to northwest winds, 20 to 25 knots. Bristol Bay, gale warnings, east winds, 40 knots, seas 6 to 8 feet. And for Kodiak Island, gale warnings also, east winds, 45 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, south to southwest winds 25 to 30 knots. Gale warnings for Adak and Atka, west winds 35 knots. And gale warnings for the western Aleutians, west to northwest winds 35 to 40 knots. Thursday, western Aleutians here, Kiska to Shemya, northeast winds 30 to 35 knots. Adak and Atka, south winds 30 knots. And for the Fox Islands, west-southwest winds at 25 knots. For the southwest coast tomorrow, gale warnings, south of Nunivak Island, southeast winds 40 knots. For the Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, east winds 35 knots, even stronger there for Norton Sound. Gale warnings there at 40 knots out of the east and northeast 40 for St. Matthew Island, while the Pribilofs will be looking at a southeast wind at 30 knots. And for Thursday, Pribilof southwest at 25 knots, south 25 St. Matthew Island. And gale warnings still here for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, southeast at 40 knots, otherwise southeast 30, Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island. Almost a storm warning there for Norton Sound, but not quite. East winds 45 knots. And gale warnings for the eastern Boulevard Sea coast tomorrow out of the east at 35 knots. Otherwise, the central coast down to 20 knots and east-northeast 15 for the western Arctic coast, Chukchi Sea, brisk wind advisories. East winds 25 to 30 knots. And then those pick up to 45 knots out of the east here for the Chukchi Sea. And much of the Arctic coast looking at brisk wind advisories for east winds at 25 knots.